So I, and we're recording just to remind me I'm on the record now. Fantastic. I'll share my screen in a moment in terms of slides, but so as Mark says, I live up in Portstewart, north coast of Northern Ireland. I will try and keep the chat open. If I get excited, I know I speak fast. So if you're struggling to keep up, put your hand up, wave on screen, send a message to Mark, say, get that guy to slow down. So I will try my best because I do get passionate about culture and politics. I'm here in Portstewart. My wife is out running and is shortly coming back to train. So we're doing some multitasking. I have two girls, a 12 and an 8-year-old, just to give you a little bit of context. And I get the joy and privilege of working for the Evangelical Alliance. So my journey into that was I was a lawyer, a court lawyer, so a barrister, dressed up in a funny wig and gown. I got paid to argue with people. I could think of nothing better. I'm trying to ditch that habit. I have repented. It's fine. I then went off to Regent College in Vancouver. Got to study with some wonderful people like J.I. Packer, Eugene Peterson, who helped with the message translation, and other people, and really thoroughly enjoyed that experience. And that's really where my passion for faith in the public square and faith in workplace as well, but tonight the public square aspect of that really came from. So for the past almost 9 years, I think I've been working for the Evangelical Alliance in various roles. So I'm now UK director, and we've been around for 175 years this year. And we are excited about unity for mission. So we want to see people come to know Jesus. But we're also, I've always had a passion for advocacy and work in the public square. And that's the part of the organization that I lean most heavily into. But I think all those things can come together. Our engagement with the public square always has this missional edge. And so with Mark's indulgence, I'm going to look a little bit at culture and politics because I think they're totally interlinked. So the second half will be much more on the politics, but I do want to set a wider frame because that's where my passion and interest lies in bringing these things together. So I'm now going to have the nervous moment where we share screens and check all the technologies doing what we hope it's doing. So I think that's, you can hopefully see my screen, and I'm going right out into full screen mode. So, and this is where I remember that I'm working with two different computers and can't remember which one's controlling the screen. Here we go. So I kind of frame sometimes the story and the engagement with culture around this thing called the grid. You have notes, and the bits that I know well and want to talk about say very little in the note, and then the other bits are fuller. So this bit just says like the grid, I think. But what I want to look at here is there's a story our culture is telling us, and then we're trying to work out where our faith fits. And when I went off to university to study law, I bumped into a whole other way of thinking. I've been raised in a Christian home, gone to a relatively small Baptist church here in Portstewart. And someday I went off to uni and realized there was a whole other way of thinking of the world. And being very creative and artistic, I frame it a little like this kind of horizontal line, this arrow that seemed to be driving. And everybody seemed to think, oh, there's this particular way of seeing the world. Nobody would actually say what it was. I would say I was influenced by, there was kind of, we're progressive, we're secular, we're individual, but nobody would say those words necessarily. There's just this accepted, this is surely the way everybody sees the world. And the point was, it wasn't clear to me where my Christian faith, where my love of Jesus fitted in that. And for a while, I really struggled with working that out. Did it run the opposite direction? Was it going at a slight angle? And over time, I really began to conclude it was coming, it was jarring with, it was cutting across the dominant way of seeing the world. It started in a radically different place with the creation story in Genesis 1 and 2. And that framed my sense of identity and relationship and purpose. And heading to a radically different place in terms of Revelation 21 and God making his dwelling place with humanity. And these joints came much later as the way I would articulate this. But as I worked with a colleague, we noticed, this did form a cross. And actually at the intersection of the cultural story, the political story, the world story, and the God story, we find Jesus at the heart of the public square. And by that, I mean, he so upset the political rulers of his day. He so upset the religious rulers of his day that they had him crucified, that they put him on a cross. And so for me, this is where the intersection gets really interesting. I am deeply passionate about the God story and very interested in the cultural story and where the intersection happens, where we find ourselves. The reason for that is this, Tom Wright says this, the whole point of Christianity is that it offers a story which is the story of the whole world. It is public truth. I was raised in a tradition that was probably a little bit more privatized about faith. It was all about my relationship with Jesus, and that was the important thing. And it was very much a kind of personal and private matter. Of course, we wanted to see people encounter Jesus, but there were very kind of limited ways in which we thought about that. And it was very much about the saving of the soul and quite individual in the way it was articulated. And Tom Wright's pushing to say, there's no such thing as a private faith. There's no such thing as saying, well, I'd leave my faith at the door of work. That's not a possibility. If this story is true, and I absolutely believe it is, then it's true, and it is the story of the whole world. It is public truth. And I've always been intrigued by, if that's the case, why are we sometimes struggling as Christians then to engage in the public square? Why are we wrestling with the kind of impact that we're having? And I think that the kind of half story is potentially a helpful way of thinking about that, depending on where you were raised and the traditions you were raised in. And so the church historians tell us that for about 1850 years, Christians, especially in the UK and in a Western context, but actually I think this is true beyond that, but I'm going to say exclusively that because I realize people are dialing in from different parts of the world. But we have told a story, a richer and a fuller story of creation, fall, redemption, restoration. People lived for a long time in communities. We had time to tell that story. We built that story up over time, and we had cultural influences. We told that larger gospel story. And what the historians tell us is that late 1800s, early 1900s, there began to be a shift, all sorts of reasons. People were moving away from church a little bit. We began to have more missional events, the kind of traditional mission that some of you might be familiar with. We have an evening, one presentation to communicate the gospel to people who don't know that much about it. And so inevitably, you can't get the whole swathe of the 66 books of the Bible in. And what began to happen there was we began to strip out parts of the creation story and the restoration of all things and told arguably a fairly simplistic gospel message. I pick on Mark because I know him. It was something like this: Mark, you're really bad. You've got a problem. The lawyer in me is fine with that because I've also in the back pocket got the golden ticket to heaven that I'm offering Mark. And I said, but it's okay. Jesus died for you. Here's the ticket to heaven that will save your soul. And so we narrated a fall, redemption, more limited story. One of the implications with that was it became quite individual. It's all about the person and the saving of their souls. But what's culturally happened, arguably in the last 20 or so years, is it's unacceptable for me now to say to Mark, you're really bad. Now, I know Mark well enough. I feel comfortable saying that. Some of you know him. You probably know it to be true. But I'm no longer able to say that to Mark. So I don't say you're really bad anymore. I just say Jesus loves you. And that becomes like a quarter gospel story. So much so that I would say it's not the gospel at all. It's so thin. It doesn't have any purchase. Maybe somebody's persuaded for a day or a few days. But when anything comes along, there's been no depth. There's been no conversion because we haven't narrated anything that's wrong. We haven't narrated the fall. The other way to go is, of course, to re-inhabit the fuller story, the richness of creation, fall, redemption, restoration, the renewal of all things. And the reason I want to do that is I want to suggest that part of the reason we lost our cultural currency as Christians, our cultural engagement at that time, is because we shrunk the gospel story. And the cultural historians tell us that prior to that, you had people like William Wilberforce, famous for the abolition of slavery, but not just for that, for the Chimneys Act and the Factories Act, for passing legislation that stopped children from being forced up the chimneys and working in factories. He was part of that Clapham sect that many of you may have heard of, that also was involved in the Sunday school movement, which was really the precursor to all education as we know it, the Reformation of manners, and a much wider movement of all sorts of cultural reform. The Earl of Shaftesbury, similar, engaged in the welfare system, again, driven by his Christian beliefs. And after that, we had less of that, less political and cultural engagement, because we became, I stereotype a little, but I think there's a lot of truth to this, very interested in the saving of souls and individuals, and fail to recognize the scale and the breadth of the larger biblical story and its cultural and its political implications. And so the full story, I would say, reminds us we're made in God's image, that sin enters the world. Whereas the half story is much more about I'm a sinner. It's a very individual take on it. The full story is saying, look, the fix, the solution is life through Jesus. The half story is I invite Jesus into my heart. I'm the primary mover. That's what I would have done as an 8-year-old. But as I look back, that wasn't perhaps the healthiest way of framing that. Because what God's actually doing is there's an ongoing God story in our world of God's acts of redemption. It's been going on 4 generations, and it's going on across cultures, and God invites me into that story, and that story shapes me. Whereas much of our narrative is I invite Jesus in, and I kind of shape Jesus and fit him into my life. And our purpose is the renewal of all things on the full story, whereas often on the half story, it becomes shrunk down to converting others, saving souls, separating from the world, and kind of waiting for heaven until we die. It's like, I'm a Christian, get me out of here, rather than a missional engagement with this world and an investment and engagement with culture and politics. And so that's why I wanted to start a little wider on that lens and think a little bit more about how the story has been shaped. I think we need to fundamentally understand the God story better and in a richer and fuller way. And we need to understand the cultural story and the points of intersection on my grid, because I think that's where we find Jesus in the text. He was constantly in the heart of the public square, in the marketplace, right in amongst people, provoking, not arguing, that's it, but always challenging people, always jarring with what was going on around him. And we feel that today. That's the place we are often in the public square. We are coming from a less Christian culture and perspective more and more, and we will find ourselves jarring with the culture around us. And that cultural context just informs the waters that we swim in. I want to say that in case some of you are going, this sounds a bit like something that Mark said. I mean, I did see Mark's notes, and I am covering some similar ground, but again, to set context. And the teacher in me says, no harm in a bit of revision anyway. So it's slightly different approach, but it's very similar ideas. And the culture around us does a number of things. Culture very much communicates meaning. We are enculturated into a story. And if we go to a different culture, we know that we get enculturated in. We learn the traditions and the story of that culture and its ways of communication. It's so much more than just language. There's a whole way in which we say something that communicates meaning. Culture shapes our desires. We are constantly being formed in various ways by our phones, by adverts, by the media and music we listen to, the movies that we watch. And we get our word cult from that, the kind of cult of worship, because culture shapes our desires. But we also get this word cultivate. Culture is something that grows and develops. Those of us who are gardeners know that we cultivate things in our gardens or on our farms or in our agricultural spaces, because culture is constantly developing and growing, and we are to steward and to cultivate it. So culture is this incredibly rich and large and complex idea, which politics has a significant influence over. The former chief rabbi is a guy called Jonathan Sachs. He's passed away a year or two ago, but he had this wonderful phrase that I really liked about accelerated cultural climate change. So look, we're aware of environmental climate change. We have the COP summit, COP26, I think it is, coming up in Glasgow over later this month and into early November. We've had these series of conversations about what's going on in climate change, the impact of it. He says, at least we're discussing it, engaging in it. At least as important, he would argue, or did argue, sorry, was cultural climate change. Changes to the family, changes to community, changes to society. We're not even prepared to talk about them. And one of the challenges for us, I think for all of culture, but for us as Christians engaging in it, is the speed at which it's currently changing. The pandemic has only accelerated that, the speed of change in the last year and a half. There's positives, there's what we can do. We can have a course online like this, we can gather from around the world, but that has also sped up the rate of change in various cultures and environments. Here's a political example of the speed of change. The lady on the left was the education secretary, a lady called Nicky Morgan. So she's a Conservative MP and she was a government minister. In 2013, she was opposed to gay marriage or same-sex marriage. In 2014, she changed her position and said, no, I back it now. By 2015, as education secretary, she said, if you're opposed to gay marriage, that's actual possible evidence of extremism. Now, it's one thing to have changing views. I have serious questions about that. But in 2 years, she moves from one view to the opposing view and then says, if you hold the view I had just 2 years ago, that might well be evidence of extremism. That's an incredible rate of change. Which is leading on that? Is it culture? Is it politics? And I would argue they're just heavily intertwined, which is why we need to understand them both. And it's why I'm spending this little bit of time examining a little bit around culture and then its impact on politics. Some of you might be familiar with this story, but this is a picture of the Choluteca Bridge in Honduras. This bridge was actually built by the US Marine Corps. It's actually a mini version of the iconic bridge in San Francisco, the name of it, the Golden Gate Bridge. So they built this to connect parts of Honduras, and it was in the 30s, I believe it was built. So the Honduran government, realizing the significance of this, and went out to get a new bridge built. They get a lot of hurricanes in that part of the world, and so the spec was this bridge had to be able to withstand hurricanes. And so they built a new bridge. It wasn't very exciting, so nobody took a good picture. So that's what I have. There's no good pictures. It's a very solid, standard, somewhat boring bridge. And it was completed, I believe, in 1998. And the very year it was completed, Hurricane Mitch, a Category 5 hurricane, came and hit Honduras, and the bridge obviously had to withstand the impact or deal with the impact of this hurricane. And so literally it'd been open a few months when this hurricane came and hit it. And the big question is, well, what would be the impact? Would the bridge survive? What would be left behind? And this is what happened. The bridge survived. The bridge was an engineering marvel in a way, but the river moved. The waterway moved because the hurricane was so substantial and severe. It moved the water course and moved the river across. So you've got this bridge, this fantastic bridge, really well engineered. And the waters moved, the rivers moved. And so what is the purpose of the bridge? To carry you across the water. So while it's a fantastic bridge, it's actually fundamentally a useless bridge because it doesn't get you from A to B across the water. And the reason I show it, somebody was just challenging us recently about, is that where we are with the church in relation to culture? Some of what we have built to engage in it for the last 50 years has actually been incredibly effective. It's done a fantastic job. When you think about what the church has done, I'm thinking particularly in the UK, but not exclusively, it's actually done a great job of evangelizing, of discipling people, of bringing them into those contexts. And actually the church built in nearly every town and community. It offered a whole variety of both services in terms of kind of Sunday and worship services, but also youth and community engagement. And actually many of the models were excellent. But the river has moved. Culture has shifted, I think, in this pandemic in a more extreme way. And the question that I want you to ponder as we're kind of going through is the bridge and some of the structures that we built for an old model, and the river has moved to the side. I wonder what that means for our churches as we return from the pandemic more generally into the regathering environment, and as we think about our engagement with culture. I think we've got a great bridge and the river has moved, and we need to think about that as we do cultural engagement. Now, I'm going to keep begging your indulgence a little bit because I do think this sets us up for politics as to what's going on in our culture and therefore why political engagement is both so important, but also so challenging. I think there are three big kind of deep currents going on in the culture that we need to be alert to. Some of you will be excited about this. Some of you will love your isms and your kind of snazzy word. If you want to look intellectual, just stick ism on the end of every word, and that's the way to do that. But let me just kind of look at these three big trends and try and make them as accessible as possible and as relevant to the world we're in, because I think they are. And then in the second half, we'll look much more at our kind of political response to some of this. So secularism, belief is up for grabs. Secularism has lots of definitions. I think one that is often used is there is no God, we've given up on God. And that's partly true, but I prefer this language of belief is up for grabs, that basically all views are contested and contestable. There's a wonderful guy, Charles Taylor, who's written a bit about this. And he says, look, 500 years ago, it was almost unthinkable not to believe in God. Today, it's almost unthinkable to believe in God. And he's just talking about some of that shift in our culture. But one of the points he makes is that actually it's not that nobody believes anymore. It's just that all beliefs are contested. So some of you might know Richard Dawkins, who wrote The God Delusion and other books. When Richard Dawkins made some statements on transgender that people didn't think were appropriate, guess what? They took his award away and they disinvited him from speaking too. When J.K. Rowling, who wrote the Harry Potter books, said something about women that people didn't like, and again about trans people, they started trying to bar her. They wanted to cancel her. Now, J.K. Rowling is about as woke, if you like that language, as progressive politically as they come. She's getting cancelled. Some of you locally will know Stephen Nolan, our local radio producer who I sometimes spar with. He's just released a podcast in which he basically takes apart Stonewall, the leading gay rights charity in the UK. That's fascinating. They don't get a free pass anymore because a radio journalist like Stephen Nolan is going after them, and he's going after them hard in that podcast if you haven't heard it. And all that to say, nobody gets a free pass. All beliefs are contested today. We feel it as Christians that ours are the ones most up for grabs. And of course, it's complicated because we live in this Christian culture largely in the UK, but also in other parts of the world. So we feel it even more so. A lot of the current human rights and equality movement is pulling from the tree of Christianity while simultaneously taking an axe and chopping down the roots. Because you don't get to equality, you don't get to rights except on the God story. There's an author, Tom Holland, who's written the book Dominion, and he's an agnostic historian. I would have said atheist a while ago. He's agnostic. Some people are saying he's more than that. He seems to be on a journey towards Jesus as he's writing about history, and particularly on Christianity. But he's saying that today's equality and human rights frameworks, whether people recognize it or not, are deeply Christian. You don't get there any other way. So as those are being kind of pulled apart and argued about, we feel it because it's our story, our God story that has given culture and politics that story, but now they're pulling it apart. So they're contested, they're fragile, and they're complicated. By fragile, I just mean that our beliefs, people are moving in their beliefs. Doubters are tempted to believe, believers are tempted to doubt. It's more contested out there. I'm meeting more and more Christians who have moments of doubt, but also more and more of my non-Christian friends who are sending their kids to Sunday school, who want them to have some sort of values, who have these moments of death or sickness where they hope there's something more. And so secularism just means we're in this really contested space, and you can feel that contesting, I would say, if you're on social media, if you follow politics, you look at what just happened very sadly to this MP, and then the outpouring around that, lots of MPs saying that their surgeries and their social media feeds are really, really toxic at people just pushing back at them. We live in a really contested, fragile, complicated public square in which all beliefs, all ideologies and ideas are being pushed and pulled around. And actually, I think that's a huge opportunity as Christians. For many, they see it as negative. I'm actually like, this is really interesting. This is a missional space to lean into. I think the second thing we see is a lot of this deconstructing and power dynamics and pulling apart of stories. Everybody's like, who's powerful? How do we unsettle their power? There's a lot of chat about justice, about social justice. That gets very contested around things like intersectionality and critical race theory, if you're into those ideas. And here's the problem. We live in what's called a post-truth world. People talked about that. It became word of the year in 2016, came around Brexit and then Trump and various sort of contested factors. And basically the idea was truth doesn't matter anymore. So I pick on Mark because I hit home again. Mark has his truth and I have my truth. He has his story and I have my story. And that's kind of the post-truth world, the postmodern world. Everybody has a different story and that's fine. Until I bump into Mark. I mean, I literally bump into Mark. If I bump into Mark, this is kind of a moment of, oh, what, did I bump into him? Did I accidentally knock him? Did I kind of drop the shoulder and shoulder charge him? Well, to resolve that, to get justice, so let's say Mark actually gets injured when I bump into him, we need to get to the truth if we want to have justice. But in a post-truth world, you can't get there because I said, well, I have my story. I was just wandering along. Mark bumped into me and Mark's like, man, you looked at me, you clearly shoulder charged me. And I'm like, no, you just have your story, I have my story. And then those stories clash. And we're seeing that in our culture. It doesn't work saying we're in a post-truth world, because as soon as you want to have a court case, as soon as you want to actually get justice, we need to find truth. How do you do that in a post-truth world? It's kind of this crazy deconstruction. So we're living in a world that's pulling everything apart. And all you end up doing is you don't have truth is, it becomes a power grab. My story is more powerful than you. I'm more privileged than you are, or I'm more marginalized than you are. And so you have these stories competing for who gets to tell, who's more powerful in that moment. Because you can't decide between stories based on truth anymore. We're in a post-truth world. And so again, that's really complicated because the church has been powerful and we have some questions around that, but we do love the ideas of justice and truth and actually rightly understood power. And so we want to be part of those conversations, but those are big ideas in our political forum at the minute. Who is powerful and should have power? What is true? And what does justice look like in our world? And the final big trend, I think, underpins all of this. And this is, I promise my long introduction to culture, but it is really half of what I want to say, is around individualism. In my little image here, the orange guy, because it took me a minute to work it out, it's got a little crown. You know, the individual is king in this moment. It's all about me is the current cultural narrative. And what happened really was, over time, people said, look, there is no God. I reject God. I'm not interested in what's going on here. So who's going to become the boss? So we turn inwards and we say, well, I'm in charge of me. I write my own script. I decide who I am. I decide what's important in my life. And so you have this turn inwards. And everybody's driven by authenticity now. That's the kind of narrative out in our culture. So you got to be true to yourself. It's that kind of language you've heard. You got to be authentic. If you watch enough Oprah or you read the kind of columns in the papers and stuff, it's all about being authentic to yourself, being true to yourself. So you can reach the point where I was talking to somebody and they said, I need to leave my husband, and it just happened to be that way around in this case. She said, I need to leave my husband because I've fallen in love with somebody else. And to be true to myself, to be authentic, I need to go off with this new person and leave my marriage because I no longer love him. I wouldn't be being authentic if I stayed with my husband. The authentic thing to do, the true thing to be true to myself, is to go off with this new person that I love. They were framing this in a Christian conversation, that was the authentic and true thing to do. Why do I use marriage as an illustration? Because we're obsessed with sex as a culture. And that's all Freud's fault. It's not actually Christians' fault. We're not obsessed. Our culture is. Sigmund Freud, the psychologist and psychoanalyst, drove and said, look, we are sexual beings, first and foremost. That's what we are. And so our sex identifies who we are. That's why much of our cultural conversations around sex, even though Freud has been actually largely rejected academically and scientifically, he still shapes much of our cultural narrative. And so we end up in a kind of consumer-driven society. It says, I'm in charge. I'll take what I like. I'll put on what identity I like. And we do need to be careful because this has come right into our churches. If you say to somebody, how was church on a Sunday? Certainly pre-pandemic, it's a little different now maybe, but still fundamentally, how was it? Well, I enjoyed the worship, or I didn't really like the preacher. I didn't really like the sermon. It's very much about what I got out of it. How was it for me? What was my reflection on it? And we've set up often a kind of very individualized version of salvation. It's I invite Jesus into my heart. I pick the church that I go to. I drive past the ones I don't like, and I go to somewhere that's going to satisfy my needs. A consumer mentality to church. And I think these depths then lead to what we see currently around us, an age of distraction. So our attention is constantly being taken away. And the difficulty with that is, so, you know, some of you are familiar with this phone. I'm holding up in the wrong place, a phone. So it's hard to believe, was old enough to go to university when we didn't have phones. I was one of the first people just after as a lawyer. And I had a Nokia 6310, a famous old phone. Now, it was impossible to spend more than about 20 minutes on a phone when I was a young lawyer. You could spend about 10 minutes making a phone call, and then that was you broke or bankrupt because it was so expensive. And you could play a little game called Snake, if you remember those older phones. And you could spend about 10 minutes doing that, and then you were done. It was sort of a pretty dull game. Most of you got a thing that will tell you your screen time on these kind of devices, and it doesn't matter what one you have. 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours a day. It doesn't matter what we're doing, just to stop there for a second. Like, at best, you were spending 10, 20 minutes a day 20 years ago. It's now going to be 3-4 hours a day. That alone is just a massive shift. So the moments when you would have thought about God and engagement, the moments when you might have thought more deeply about the world, are taken up by all sorts of things on your phone. Not all bad, but it just distracts us. We know it's led to disintegration and fragmentation. You talk about the filter bubbles on Facebook, the small worlds that you're in, the little tribes that we all enter into, and the kind of fractional and factionalism that we get. And we see that in politics. So we're much more disintegrated and fragmented. It's harder to hold together a political party around a unified set of views. It's really difficult. You're in any party, they take a position on a social issue, suddenly, oh, you're on the wrong side. Can you hold that? Can we all stay together? And so you get smaller and smaller and smaller categories and groups. And we've seen a huge rise in despair, in the kind of anxiety, in the loneliness, in the guilt, the shame that goes with that. And we're just seeing it writ large across our culture. One of the things we learned from the pandemic was we're nowhere near as individualistic as we thought. We need people desperately. But when we don't have those interactions, it leads us towards despair, because the pressure we put on ourselves as individuals, when you write your own script, when you reject God, when you reject other sources of authority, the family, church, and community and neighborhood, and you say, I'm in charge, inevitably you let yourself down, because no individual can bear that weight. And then we turn inwards on ourselves and blame, and that leads to depression, sometimes to self-harm, and to more serious implications. Oh, well, I'm going there in a second. So let me skip past those things to say, how does that land, particularly in the sexuality? For some of you, this will be helpful just as we finish this section. I'll check we are. So here's the story of our culture. There is no God. That's the secularism piece. I know I've said that slightly differently, but belief's up for grabs. There's no God. We are therefore the center of the universe. We're sexual beings, Sigmund Freud and others teach us. So our sexuality defines us. Sexual fulfillment is the key to human flourishing. And so we tell our politicians, freedom to express our desires is a basic human right. That is the top of the tree when it comes to rights, is my sexual freedoms to have sex with who I like. That's the cultural story that our politicians are influenced by. I think the God story is fundamentally different. We're saying there is a God, and God is the center of the cosmos. We're human beings, not sexual beings. Our image bearing defines us. Love of God is the key to our flourishing, and therefore we submit our desires. That's the most controversial bit. We submit our desires to the will of God. If I put those side by side, you begin to see how you're building a very different frame of reference in our culture. So for many in the political world, they start with there is no God, and they build from there. And therefore you can see why you reach a point where you say freedom to express our sexual desires is the most basic human right. That's the key, because we're sexual beings. There's no other way or lens they have on this world. I'm going to skip past that. Well, all they're saying there is, but the base layer, the bottom sections of that pyramid no longer need to be there. That we almost don't discuss them as a culture. So we just start by saying we're defined by our sexuality, and we keep building from there. Thus why so much of our political conversation is around sexual rights and sexual freedoms as our culture would define it. That's why the conversation is there. And therefore, when there is a God, i.e. if we're Christians or somebody becomes a Christian, they find it so jarring to sit in this culture, which is so obsessed with sexual freedom and that narrative. It's not a coincidence that it happened. It's not driven by the church. It's driven by our cultural conversation. And I'm finishing with this slide because this is the more complicated piece. You see, it starts with there is a God and God's the center. It starts in our Christian frame, but then there's a very slight shift in the light gray halfway up. It's not our image bearing that defines us, it's our image. It's who I am, my individualism. God's love of me is key for my flourishing, not my love of God. That's the little twist there. So our desires are God-given and we should be authentic to them. That's what that lady was telling me. Oh, those desires came from God. I now love somebody else. I need to leave my marriage and go and be with that person. And I think these are really significant cultural shifts that are going on. And we see the light gray at the top, little tiny shifts in the culture. It's not my love of God, it's his love of me. It's not my desires. I'm not going to submit my desires to him. My desires are God-given. Therefore, I'm a Christian and I'm trans. I'm a Christian and I'm gay. I'm practicing. I'm a Christian and I'm leaving my husband or my wife to go off with somebody else. And these are incredibly challenging for us as a church as we engage in the cultural conversation, because we are called to live at this intersection. That is our role where the cultural story is driving along. And I think we need to understand it better if we're going to engage politically and culturally. But we need a fuller and a richer understanding of the God story that will lead us to this intersection point where what we think and the way we live will jar with the world around us. And to be crystal clear, this is not just like academically. I mean by living and loving and committed marriages, by honoring our kids and our kids honoring us, by living in those family units and extended family units. I mean prophetic words, I mean healing. In all sorts of ways, we are going to jar with the secular story. And that's good and that's right, as long as we're doing it to point to Jesus, not just for the sake of trying to be different. But it is going to be tough to wrestle with and to follow Jesus right into the heart of the public square. For him, it cost him his life. For us, it will cost us credibility at times. It will cost us friends. It will cost us difficult conversations. But I absolutely believe that God's story is leading us there. I believe Jesus has gone there first, and we have been equipped by the Holy Spirit to go and to have those conversations. So I want to encourage you that that's where we need to find ourselves. And I hope I have begged your indulgence to go a bit longer on that, and we're going to take a break and go into breakout rooms in about a minute, just to kind of pause and see what resonated and what jarred with you. We'll do a little bit of Q&A, and then I'm going to get a bit more political, because I have engaged in both Westminster politics and local politics a bit, but I felt it was important to set that frame. So he says, hopefully, here are the questions. I believe and I hope in about 30 seconds, somebody's going to assist me in putting you in breakout rooms. We're just going to go for 5-6 minutes max. We're not going to feed back from these. It's basically just what jarred in this first session, like what was like, oh, and where'd you go? Oh, that really resonates. That's helpful. And then we'll do a little bit of Q&A, so you can be thinking of that for about 10 minutes when we come back, and then I'll go into a second section on politics. So breakout rooms, these two questions, it's a breather for 5 minutes as well. Off you go.
All right, thanks. Melanie, can you do that for us? Can you do the breakout rooms? I've made you co-host, sweetheart, so there we go. Fantastic, Peter. Really, really good, sir. Thank you so much for that.
You're welcome. And the army bridge is still there, Faye. It's just they needed another bridge. I think it survived.
That's a remark. I've seen the picture before. I couldn't tell you where it was, but it's a remarkable picture, isn't it? So it's just incredible. All right, let people get going. How long do you want to give them, Peter?
It's 5 or 6 minutes, about 18 minutes past, we can come back and we'll go on from there.
All right.
Melanie's happy to do that.
Yeah, I think that they're all set up now, so people are just needing to click on the thing. I'll put a wee message in just to let them know. Type. wonder how I typed it all. Let's type a message here.
I'm going to go and grab a glass of water just for my
You're
throat.
well, you go ahead, sir. I'll look at this. All right.
Right, Mark Stone. You're not the administrator, right?
Right. I'm sorry. I'm a bit above myself there. I'm sorry. I'll behave myself.
Stop messing with the system.
It's funny. Oh dear. I felt awful. Peter, I had my computer on mute. So did you know this at the beginning? No, Melanie.
I did hear that, yeah.
No, oh dear. What a anyway, there we are.
I'm just going to start closing the rooms because everybody gets a minute's notice.
Okay. Excellent. That's them coming back in just less than a minute now, Peter.
Actually, we put those messages in the wrong place. You have to broadcast into the breakout rooms.
Oh, right. So
Don't see the chat in the breakout rooms.
Do you normally do Q&A just by people asking orally, putting their hand up or whatever?
Yeah, but we'll both. Melanie will keep an eye on the questions on the chat as well, Peter. But they're you know, if you give them a pregnant pause to let them have a think, then you'll generally get some people asking questions. So yeah, work away. So both, basically.
Great.
We're away.
Okay, great.
Wonderful.
Ask everyone to mute. That would be great. Thank you. Okay, Peter, over to you, sir.
Great. So welcome back, everybody. I realized we covered a lot of ground. It was really good that Mark asked for written notes for some of you, I'm sure, to be able to help process that. So it's really open to questions on that cultural piece and what's going on. And then in about 10 minutes, I'll kick into a little bit more on politics. So you can put your hand up, ask, shout, or put them in the questions.
I haven't found how to put your hand up yet. Does somebody want to give me a pointer?
What are reactions?
You go, Faye. As you've been to Morelli's, you get the first question.
I know how to eat ice cream.
Okay,
Oh,
for anybody else who doesn't know, if you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll see reactions. And whenever you press on reactions, then there's some options for raising your hand or giving a thumbs up.
I think I've got Anne-Marie.
Yeah.
Hand up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just have a problem with when people come into the church and they're cohabiting and they're only young Christians. Well, they say they're Christians, as I don't know to what level of commitment they may be. How do you deal with that when other people in the church are kind of saying, oh, they shouldn't be together and all that, like, especially if they have a family?
Yeah, so I mean, context is huge for that. What I want to be doing is taking them on a journey in that, for sure. It slightly depends on their background, where they're coming from.
Mm-hmm.
And part of it is, are they resistant to getting married? Are they living in the kind of more secular sex story? Or are they open to the discipleship journey? I find there's a book on a guy called War of Loves by a guy, Dave Bennett, who was gay and became a Christian. And he talks just about the time it took to make that journey through to living orthodoxly. But initially, if somebody told him straight away, day one, you need to leave your boyfriend, he would have been out the door. I find that hard to read. I don't know, tell you, but actually, as I've read the book over the journey and got to know David, I understand it took time. So you're trying to balance the discipleship journey and the reality of pastoring somebody with being really clear as well on what we believe. But the fundamental thing, I suppose I'm saying, is, are they even accepting that that's what we're saying at this moment? We want to push back into the secular story that says you can just do as you like, you can stay as you are. Oh yeah, I follow Jesus, I don't really need to obey anything. And we're saying you do.
But if they want to be involved in any type of ministry, like within the church, you know, I would have a difficulty with that.
Yeah, I agree. So that you're doing the welcome piece, but as people are being discipled and into leadership, absolutely, they need to be living into that. I guess for some, it's that pointing out that we are living in a different story. This is about sacrificing and submitting our own desires. What that means is something in marriage, which is exactly that, where we then make a lifelong commitment to do that in a different way. Cohabitation is different. It's not the same. Most cohabitations end before a child's 5th birthday. It's a different arrangement. Marriage is a lifelong commitment. So yeah, hopefully.
Yeah. And what do you say to somebody that may want to cohabit, to see, are they compatible to each other?
Well, I'd say to anybody, it's a disastrous idea and all the evidence is against it.
Okay.
So that's just overwhelmingly true no matter what. Cohabitation is, so 14% of cohabitations end on the 1st anniversary because guys suddenly realize they hadn't made a commitment. That, you know, I think it's 49% end before a child's 5th birthday. It's a radically different arrangement. It doesn't work. And biblically, it's an untenable idea. So, but even if somebody wasn't a Christian, I'd be still saying it's a bad idea. The evidence is absolutely against you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Ken, you have a hand up.
Yeah, Peter, nice to meet you, and thank you for being with us tonight. It's really good to hear you. We in our group we talked here about what jarred or surprised us, and I suppose jointly we were of the view that nothing really surprised us or jarred us, but it was very informative. And the one thing that we did talk about was about the bridge, what is it, Choluteca Bridge, where the river had come round the bridge. And actually the bridge was still there, but it had no function, and how it is that we've got to be ready for the run of the water changing. But I suppose overall it was the part about private faith that got us, that resonated with us. We have to have a private faith. We're not allowed to say what we believe. We're not allowed to be honest in terms of what the Bible says. And you talked about the public square. Jesus spent his ministry, and if we want to learn how to minister, we need to study the ministry of Jesus. He spent his time in the public square and died for it, as you said. And we must be bold, but in our boldness, we must know how to hold the argument, how to hold the debate, not being foolish with throwaway comments, and certainly not based solely on someone else's opinion.
That's a much better summary than I gave, so I should take that and just do that. That would save me about half an hour there of my talk. Thank you. So I agree. I think it's very much the public nature, but it is challenging, and so the inclination is to privatize because that's relatively easy. I think Tom Wright is right to say it's not actually an option. We've got to be living out publicly, but that will be tough.
Yeah.
But very, very few churches, Peter, are actually teaching on the very difficult arguments. And it's not something you're going to get up on Sunday morning and teach people how to argue against homosexuality or transism or whatever. But certainly, I think churches are inclined to shy away from it because it's a difficult topic.
Yeah, and the one thing I'd say there is I think I agree in the sense, but we've also got to not just argue against, we've got to articulate a better vision forward of what marriage is, why family works, why it's important. It's not simply a defensive posture, which I think we've got into too easily. So absolutely, but I think we can do a better positive articulation and modeling that, and we've got to do that well and invite people in and say, this works. Look at how this extended family, this church community gather around one another. Look at how we look after one another. So we've got to do it. We have to teach into it too, because whether we like it or not, you're absolutely right. Our kids are learning about it in school environments. It's on every single TV show. It's in every single newspaper article. It's relentless on the media. We've got to be ready to engage it, but let's not be as scared of it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Faye, I think you have a question about ice cream flavors for me. No, it was your hand was up. It's gone down now.
It was answered.
You were just testing out the raise hand button, weren't you, again?
Peter, there's a couple of there's a couple of questions in the comments section. There's another one there. Tracy has asked an interesting question. Culture has been individualism, but do you think from the start of COVID that governments are pushing us into collectivism, that we all have to act as one?
So I think that's a great question. I think there's a couple of things there. Certainly it has pushed back on individualism. I think we have, as I was hinting, realized that we can't live as on our own as we maybe thought. There are some positive aspects, I think, of COVID that have said we actually need to be more collective and community minded. There's lots of great WhatsApp groups got set up in that moment. People got more connected with their neighbors. Maybe people like me who actually traveled a lot to work, but we're now more local. And there are some negative, I think, in the way the government's tried to put everybody together. We do need to be careful about some of the identity measures being put in place, some of the kind of way in which they're potentially using this legislation to increase their power. So from a community perspective, I think it's potentially positive. We just need to be careful of the kind of authoritarian edge to that, I would say.
Yeah. Peter, I think Peter's from Kenya. I think might be Zimbabwe. Asked a question about the place of LGBT in our Christian congregations to be loved, to be condemned, or to be outrightly rejected in light of our topic today?
Yeah, so I think for me, I think the biblical text here is so welcoming but not affirming. So we're saying there's a welcome in, but the discipleship journey will be where we need to do some work. And then we need to say, what do we mean by LGBT? So there are some same-sex attracted Christians who are living orthodoxly in response to that. So they're celibate. They're saying that that is their experience. I mean, these are often quite conservative Christians, people like Vaughan Roberts, who's spoken in New Horizon, or David Bennett, who I spoke about earlier, who wrote a wonderful book, A War of Loves. But they're saying, therefore, the option for me is to remain celibate, and they need support in that. So I'd absolutely want to welcome and affirm them in their response. Those who are saying it's okay to have sex with somebody of the same sex, that's fundamentally wrong, that is unbiblical, and that's going to be a discipleship journey to say, no, we're going to welcome you in, I think, but very quickly we're going to say that's not a pathway you can continue to pursue. But we do need to be, I would want to encourage people to be really good on language and how we're clear on that. The LGBTQ community, if you want to add that, did a good job on this. The Q is for questioning in some spaces, sometimes queer. But what they did say is, if you've got a question, come to us. And what we were too often perceived as saying as the church is, if you've got questions, go and sort yourself out, go elsewhere. And the real risk is that people do go elsewhere, they get affirmed in a different way, in an unhealthy way, and that's not a good thing. So I would encourage us to continue to try and be welcoming. We are perceived sometimes as homophobic, and I want to make sure we're welcoming people in, but there is always a discipleship. There is always a transformation. There is a conversion. There is a change that we all have experienced that. And that is going to be the same for somebody who's same-sex attracted or gay. It's going to be the same for all of us. So I want to make sure we don't miss that.
Yeah. Mark is asking a couple of questions here. What is current UK law on public prayer, public evangelism, and so-called gay conversion therapy, where a homosexual individual approaches Christian counsellors asking for help with their sexuality? And secondly, how does society and politics in the UK reconcile the competing accessibility of abortions? You're on a roll here, Mark, versus the intent of restrictions come about by COVID. So interest, gay conversion therapy and abortion, they're two big topics.
Yeah, they are. So, and these will probably be the last I'll answer, just to say at this stage, but I'm happy to do more at the end just so we get the same. But yes, public prayer is fine, largely. I mean, you have incredible public freedoms in the UK to share your faith and to pray with people, but you need their consent if you're praying with somebody. Sharing your faith is fine in a public space. Even in a workplace, the more consistently you do that, the better it is. But again, got to be careful of power relationships and various things. In terms of abortion, we're doing quite a lot of work around that. So I'm just trying to work out the well, let's go to conversion therapy. I'll do my one moment. This is my letter from Boris that I managed to spill coffee on conversion therapy. So it's actually Boris has signed this one back because we wrote to him about it. That's likely to come out. The letter's out, but the consultation we're expecting next week, the week after. We are very alert to this, and Evangelical Alliance be one of the key voices pushing back on that. The simple thing I'd say on that is this: there have been harmful and abusive practices carried out in the past. The church has at time condoned behavior that was not healthy. I mean, to the point of encouraging sexual relations with people to try and cure people. I mean, language like that 20, 30 years ago was used was really unhelpful. But what's being banned at the minute, the proposals are that might involve prayer, and we are very clear that would be unacceptable. So the key part of what it is to be a Christian is conversion, is change, and conversion therapy and the banning of that is trying to get rid of that. So what you have is a lot of people who would say they're Christians and are saying, I'm gay and I don't need to change. And we're saying, whoa. The reason this is such an important discussion, conversion therapy, is because it goes right to the heart of our ability to pray with people and to see change in people's lives. Now, I think we've got to be really careful of the language that we use. If you go on the Evangelical Alliance website, you'll see quite a lot of detail on this because it's quite a nuanced question. But the government is going to ban something, and we have been engaging them for quite a long time trying to work out what exactly that means. We are saying that should be the harmful practices that were done in the past, and those things are wrong and should not be, wouldn't be appropriate, like electroshock therapy was practiced in the past. That's not something we want to be a part of. But we do need the space to offer prayerful and pastoral support for those who choose it and who want it. And so that's our position on that. As I say, happy to talk more about that maybe at the end. But this is the reason why I want to move in, if everybody's happy, to the second kind of half, because this is where the political questions really begin to kick in. So let me share my screen. Let me see if I can, yep, I'll go this way, 'cause it's slightly easier for me to control. Some people say politics is upstream of culture. Some people say it's downstream of culture. Our word politics comes from Aristotle, the Greek thinker. Politica, he wrote a book under that title, and the polites were the citizens. If only that were true today, that was the Greek word for citizens, and the polis was the city. And he put those kind of together and turned it into politica, our word politics. So it's about the people and the places that we operate. It has a huge amount to do with culture. They both influence each other. I don't think it's a simple culture's upstream of politics or politics is upstream of culture. You look at something like gay marriage and see how culture and politics have fed each other. You look at abortion, culture push for changes, the politicians change it, that impacts culture, and it's a constant interlocking kind of circle here. This Thursday, I have got the privilege of attending the centenary of the partition of Ireland service being run by the church leaders. It's politicians, it's civic leaders, it's going to be the Queen, I think it's going to be Boris Johnson, it's not going to be the President of Ireland, if you follow that story at all in the media. But that is a civic event, a cultural event, a political event, a church service. They're all intertwined in this moment. Vaccines, masks, regulations, they all come, some of those came up in the questions. That's politics, that's church, that's our culture. Some of you in churches where these are being discussed right now. Should we have to wear masks in these environments? What about the regulations that impact you going in and out of church at the minute? Where's the appropriate boundaries? So politics affects church and culture all the time. Stephen Nolan, who I mentioned earlier, has this podcast about Stonewall. He's pushing about their influence in our culture on the questions of sexuality and trans, conversion therapy that was just mentioned, marriage. These have all been in the culture, in the politics over the last few years. So we've seen our politicians deciding whether you can self-identify in terms of trans, whether you can get or not get conversion therapy, whether that should be banned, questions of sexuality and identity. So a lot of these social issues have become political issues, and that makes it incredibly hard for anybody operating in the political space to navigate that, to speak into it, and what's appropriate for us as Christians to say. How can we support parties? How can we engage? So I've taken a lot of this from a book called God and Government. It's a really good book if you're particularly interested in this. Now, it's not the most reader friendly. There's a little bit deeper dive, but I just want to highlight that. And my colleague, Danny Webster, who I've also been sharing information with and we've been borrowing from. So I want to look at a number of aspects I'm going to set out. Firstly, the nature of political authority, as you see in my notes. And I'll not speak fully to the notes. I'm just going to highlight this. So there are powers that are created in Genesis. In terms of God called the world into being. And in Genesis, we see the earth being created and we are given roles as human beings. We're given authority to name the animals. We're co-creators. In Genesis 1, we're told to be fruitful and to increase in number, to fill the earth and to subdue it. And we're given dominion over the earth. And it's not simply about reproduction there. It's a much bigger idea of developing culture, of stewarding creation, building societies and nations. So it starts with marriage, then the family, then the extended family, and extends out into nations as Genesis unfolds. So it's clear we have these roles as human beings, that God gave us those, that those come out of creation. And it's about organizing life together, because that's what politics is about. So we have a role in that. We have been, there are powers that are created in terms of doing that in Genesis. That would be a simple, easy thing. We just say, yes, so we should all be involved in politics. But those powers are fallen, and we know that. If you take a quick whistle-stop tour through the Bible, it doesn't take long to come across Pharaoh and the Egyptians and their oppressive regime, to come across the Babylonian and Assyrian empires, the brutality of their conquests, the Roman Empire, and its glory in one sense, and yet its goriness in another, and the cost of human dignity of their world domination. And in Daniel and in Revelation, we read about the empires of the world being described as ravaging beasts. So clearly the powers are also fallen and problematic. And so they involve human beings. Human nature is fallen and sinful. And so we're not surprised to read about that in the political realm And so there's this ambiguity as we read about it, that they are good things created by God. And yet, as Walter Wink says, they often exercise their power through violence and domination in the excess or in the extreme. And so it is something that needs to be redeemed. Nigel Wright, theologian, says fallenness is not the last word about anything or anybody, including politics. So it's a space in which we need to be involved, because the institutions and political authority impact our daily lives. And those that are there are supposed to reflect the image of God, marred in our fallen nature, but also something that can be redeemed. So we don't want to see them serving selfish ambition, but turn to serve others and to honor God. And so it's a difficult dance for those who are politicians on the front lines, but we do need to be hope carriers, the hope that the state can be used to enhance life, to promote justice, to secure peace and prosperity for others. And so there's a kind of mixed nature in the Bible about government and politics and the created order in terms of the goodness of it, the fallenness of it, and the need to be redeemed. And so it's a pretty ambiguous concept when we look at government and politics. When you put those three strands together, they're all interlinked as we read the biblical text. And we read different examples of political authority. Sometimes it's being promoted, sometimes it's clearly being critiqued in the biblical text. Sometimes we see the redemptive possibilities. And so we need to understand these three strands are kind of interwoven together. And if we focus too much on the fall, then we dismiss the potential for good. We can become paranoid about everything. If we focus too much on creation, we can be naive about the dangers. And if we ignore the redemption, then it's a very pessimistic outlook. And so we're trying to hold together these different strands of what political engagement can look like, about what government can look like, about its role to promote human welfare without being abusive. So what can we say about the nature of politics and government? I think firstly, we can say it's legitimate. It's something that God put in place. Like government is the outworking of that political authority and God's divine placing of it. So the Old Testament reminds us that God has put in place all things, the heavens and the earth. He has authority over everything, as the psalmist reminds us. In the Old Testament, God humbles the kings and the prophets of Baals and various people. In the New Testament, Jesus reminds us of his authority over all things. But he did put in place government. We know in 1 Peter and in Romans 13, governments are legitimate. We are to, they've been established by God, and therefore we should submit to them. But it's interesting, even in those very passages, there's kind of almost ambiguous sections just beforehand. There's a casting of a little bit of doubt on how we should engage with them. And then these verses that tell us we should engage. So we're told that there are legitimate forms of government. And I think almost every church in the world recognizes that. We've got to honor government. But there are limits to government because they're accountable to God. Kings remain accountable for their actions. The government is to commend the right and punish the wrong in the most simple terms. And yet that's actually pretty complicated to do. And so there's a recognition that they are limited because they are subservient and sit under the authority of King Jesus. But also governments are limited because they can't actually force people to do very much. Their coercive power is actually limited. They can't change people's minds much as they wish they sometimes could. They can influence them, but they have limits in terms of the ultimate power is to take away somebody's life. And Jesus obviously stands in the way of that and rejecting the sword. They can take away people's liberty, they can take away people's property, but they can't change fundamentally what they think. I was listening to somebody from one of the persecuted churches on Sunday in our own church who'd grown up in Iran and talking about his story of faith and his time in prison and in solitary confinement and their desire to change his mind. And much as his government would love to have done that, they were unable to do so. So we've got to remember that governments are a product of our fallen sinful nature. And so some of those limitations are because they are fallen. And so that power should be diversified and it should be spread out. There's no mandate for any particular form of government. And we learn from Israel that we had the tribes and we had the priests, we had the judges. Even when they asked for a king, it was the prophets who came and often held them to account and pushed back. There are various, if you like, branches or parts of the government there. There's not a single system with one ruler who could do all things. And so there are always limits in how the Bible talks about politics and government and its authority in that moment. And then thirdly, was that the New Testament comes with a real challenge to what the nature of government looks like. Tom Wright, the theologian's kind of written and thought a lot about this, that Christianity is underplayed and maybe even misunderstood the political purpose of Christianity. And when we say Jesus is Lord, what we're saying is Caesar is not Lord. That was a political statement. The Sermon on the Mount is very much a kind of political manifesto. But Jesus didn't ride into Jerusalem in chariots. He didn't overthrow the Roman oppressors. The Messiah, the long-awaited for Messiah, did not look like many of the Jews thought he was going to. Jesus broke the rules in various ways. He confounded his supporters. He confused his critics. Even when he comes before Pilate, there's a recognition of Pilate's authority in a kind of strange way. There's two kingdoms clashing at that moment, the Roman Empire and its political authority, and the kingdom of God represented in Jesus. And Jesus says, my kingdom is not of or from this world. He's not saying it's entirely spiritual. He's just saying it's not derived from this world, but it is for this world. Again, in your notes, you'll see Tom Wright says that precisely because it is the kingdom of the wise creator God who longs to heal this world, whose justice is aimed at restoration rather than punitive destruction. It cannot be advanced nor attained by the domineering, bullying, fighting kingdom methods employed by earthly kingdoms. So Jesus comes to bring about a kingdom. That's a political piece of terminology that looks radically different to the kingdoms around him. And so he's really jarring with the earthly rulers of the day. He strangely affirms Pilate's authority in one sense and doesn't advocate the overthrowing or add anarchy against his government. And yet he subverts it in his very actions of going to the cross. Jesus didn't come to destroy the world, but to rescue it from evil. And the structures are part of that redemption, the good creation. So we've got this, again, complex interaction with politics. It'd be easy if we just said it was all bad, or if we could embrace it and say it was all good. But actually, the New Testament, again, is challenging us. It's an invitation to understand the atonement itself as involving God's victory, not so much over the world and its powers, but over worldly ways of power. So we're not rejecting worldly powers straight and simple. It's actually reimagining and subverting how those powers are used. Power is still a good thing that has to be stewarded. Governments still have to do that. And so we have to engage with those governments. But what is the purpose of politics, and how do we as Christians engage? What does Christian leadership, to go right to the heart of our question, look like as we try and engage with government? Here's two things that have been produced by two different groups. The National Association of Evangelicals in America have a thing called For the Health of the Nation. That's a really helpful document if you're really into politics. Not particularly long, like it's only 15 pages, but it kind of sets out how they engage politically. And the thing on the left is an image from a group called Cardis in Canada, similar group looking to engage in politics. And you can see some of the themes that the group on the left have pulled out as really important. And I think for us as Christians, I'm going to take that list, if you like, and change it slightly. What is the purpose of government? What's the areas we want to be engaging with? I think it's fundamental questions of human dignity. Every human being is made in the image of God. We should have dignity and value and worth. And actually, our government wants to believe that, but can't quite frame why that's important. And so we need to help them on issues like abortion, and actually on issues around assisted dying. That's another one that's in our parliament right now. And why people are important. Everybody wants to say everybody's equal and everybody should have these rights, but it's really difficult for people to explain why, which is why when it comes to abortion and those before birth, they struggle to give them those rights. It's why when it comes to assisted dying, they're really struggling to articulate what the argument is. And they don't have a good conception of human dignity. And so part of the purpose for us as Christians in politics is to talk about that. The reason we believe everybody has that is because everybody's made in the image of God. Any act of abuse against another human being is an act of high treason against God. It's a really helpful way of thinking about it. That's why this stuff matters. That's why we're rooting for and committed to justice. Actually, many of our friends can't explain that very well, because although they say everybody's valuable, they can't explain why. Because again, if we're in a world that's driven by power, if I'm more powerful than somebody else, why shouldn't I just use them for my own ends? That's what we've seen in things like the Me Too movement. So human dignity is the first thing. Then justice and compassion for the marginalized. Jesus sums up the law by commanding us to love God and love our neighbor. And when he's asked who the neighbor is, he tells the story of the Good Samaritan, the outsider, the marginalized in that moment. Strong families. So the government's really nervous about this. Politicians are really nervous about this. You might remember, some of you are older, John Major and his Back to Basics campaign. Of course, like days or weeks later, he gets himself into trouble and, you know, it all falls apart because everybody's having affairs in his cabinet, including him. So governments don't like to talk about it, even though they know it to be true. The biggest driver of equality in our society is marriage. Marriage does, people who are married have better outcomes. The husband in particular, the man, earns more money, is less likely to take risks, lives longer, the woman does better, and the kids do better in a whole range of measures. So if you want to promote equality in a society, you would promote marriage and family. Why does nobody talk about it? All these groups are so committed to equality because marriage and family are awkward. They don't want to say they're moralizing about marriage. And so despite the fact that marriage is the single best driver of equality in our society, government won't promote it and can't talk about it. The Equality and Human Rights Commission is supposed to promote these things, won't talk about it. So we want to talk about it, and we need to find good language to try and engage government, say, actually, it works. You should get behind it. Let's talk about it. Healthy communities. You know, in Jeremiah, I put hair in the reference, maybe, sorry, Jeremiah 29:7, we're to seek the peace and prosperity, the shalom of the shalom in the place in which we've been placed for exile. It goes on to say in that passage, we're to plant our gardens, plant our vineyards, we're to build our houses, we're to marry and have kids. We're to invest in the communities around us. We want to see healthy communities. That is good for a thriving society. That's a purpose of politics, is to enhance those relationships. Instead, we're seeing a fragmentation right now. Religious freedom is a really fundamental right that we talk about a lot in our work, because God gave us freedom to worship. He hasn't made us as robots. He's given us a choice in worshiping him. And that freedom is incredibly important. Out of that comes a freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of belief that so many societies are built on. But again, that's unique to the Christian story and its way of framing. God ordained then the church and the state to be these coexisting bodies. We read through the passage of how that's interlinked. So it's really important we think about what that looks like. And when you begin to clamp down on freedom, you see the consequences. If you follow any of the free speech debates at the minute around trans, for example, that's becoming deeply problematic. Some of you might be interested in Jordan Peterson, who came to fame actually really around free speech and the trans debate. Now, half the people I speak to know Jordan Peterson and love him, the other half have no idea or don't care. But Peterson's really interesting because he frames his whole argument on free speech because God spoke and it came into being. He preaches arguably the most interesting 3 12-hour lectures in downtown Toronto that people pay to come and hear. So he's 12 weeks in a row, he preaches for 3 hours on Genesis 1 to 12. It's fascinating stuff. Half of it is incredible theology, half of it is wacky ideas he throws into, but he's framing his argument in that God spoke and the world came into being, and therefore free speech is fundamental. So it's interesting, these ideas of religious and freedom are core Christian stuff. What's the cry of the Israelites in Egypt? God heard their cries going up, and he saw his people, and he came down to set them free. That begins the narrative of the Redeemer and the releaser that Jesus is going to become in the Gospels. So freedom's a huge idea. And then finally, I put there the kind of commitment to human rights and equality that flow out of our ideas of dignity. God made males and females in his image. He endowed them with rights and responsibilities to care for this creation. Now, that's not the definitive list. We're working on some of this. So this is very much a working project for us as EA. What is the purpose? What are the areas we need to lean into? I'm just suggesting these as some of the more tangible areas we need to be leaning into when it comes to government and our engagement. What I want to do is kind of land at maybe a little more practically as we sort of finish out is somebody like Daniel. I love Daniel because Daniel, if you're a reader of the King James, Daniel was a satrap, I think it says, Everybody knows what a satrap is, of course. You might call that a SPAD, a special advisor. You might call him a prime minister. Actually, he was kind of like a regional overseer. He had various roles in various governments, but in exile. So you know the story. He's carried off into exile. He learns Babylonian language. He learns Babylonian culture. He takes on a Babylonian name. And then he draws the line. One of my favorite verses, Daniel resolves not to defile himself with the king's food and wine. And he goes through this period of testing, and they do the veg and water for 10 days. And then after 3 years, they're found to be the wisest people in the kingdom. And he's given this position of authority. And what I love about Daniel was Daniel knows the story that shapes him. He knows what it is to follow God. He knows his identity. He's been carried off to a different culture. He's learned a different language. It's like our students who go off to uni, but he knows the story that shapes him. He knows who his friends are. It's Daniel, shake the bed, make the bed, and into bed you go. Or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Just if you're Sunday school people, you're smiling. The rest are like, what did he just say? Daniel and his friends. And he builds good relationships. You know what happens when he gets the veg and water test? Like when he gets the king's food, does he just go, no? No, he goes to Ashpenaz, the palace official, and says, look, can we try this thing? And Ashpenaz isn't sure. And then he goes to the local guy and they negotiate, and he kind of comes up with this deal for 10 days. So he's got good relationships with his friends. He's got good relationships with his enemies, his oppressors, his captors. He's able to work things out so that, what's the key thing for Daniel in those relationships? When the key moment comes, he's in the room, he's in the right place when he has to do the supernatural thing. He's got access to the king, to Nebuchadnezzar, to go and interpret the dream, because he goes into the presence of God. And that's the presence piece for me, for all of us, so he can participate. So I know people that are brilliant at the supernatural, but they have no clue about culture. They can't really engage. It's just wonderful, and it's still good they do it. I know people that are brilliant at culture, but they're not very good at the supernatural. So they get into all these rooms, they don't know what to do. They can't bring God and the divine, the supernatural in. What I love about Daniel is he's got this supernatural stuff going on. He's got this cultural intelligence. He can speak the language of the Babylonians. He can get himself into any room. He can work the Babylonian culture. You get it? Like, he's got influence, he's got position, he does well. He's found to be 10 times better than anybody else. So he's made an overseer. He's excellent at what he does. And then he brings the supernatural into the room and interprets dreams and visions, because he's on his knee praying. We read later on in Daniel, I think it's 9 or 10, they catch him out praying. Why? Because he goes to the window and he faces Jerusalem. And he does it at the time of day. They still did it in Jerusalem, by the sounds of it. Like, I think we're 50 or whatever number of years into exile. And he's still doing that, still seeking after God's presence. Daniel, for me, is the best version of trying to navigate this stuff. I don't know why he takes the name. I can give you all sorts of arguments. Why does he learn the language? Why does he take the culture? Why does he take the name? The name's Belteshazzar. That's pretty obviously to a foreign god. But he does draw the line. He knows there's a place where he needs to draw the line. And it's going to be hard for us to help some of our political rulers, our counselors, our local politicians who might be in our churches. But we are going to have to try and help them know the story, their identity, build good relationships, go after the presence of God, and then participate. Daniel doesn't opt out. Daniel doesn't run away from the tough stuff. I don't know if he always gets it right, but we certainly read in the story he was in the right place on a number of occasions, and he made some divine interventions because he brought the supernatural into the room, and he stewarded it into Nebuchadnezzar and before the Babylonian kings. And so that's what excites me, because we are called to serve an alternative kingdom, not to abdicate out of politics. That's what's interesting about what Jesus did. Jesus, as Lord, as I said earlier, is a political statement saying Caesar isn't. The Sermon on the Mount, you read that through, that's a manifesto. That is a political statement into the world. Like, he's doing politics, not party politics, but he is announcing a radical kingdom coming into this world. And so we are part of this alternative witness. We are called to be part of this alternative kingdom, to be kingdom carriers. But we're going right back to the start, like Wilberforce and the Earl of Shaftesbury before. We're supposed to be engaged in this culture, not abdicating out. You see, what the historians say happened was when we shrunk the story from the big story down to just fall and redemption, we also began to narrate that heaven was around, floating around in clouds with little wings on our back and playing harps. And if you've ever been to places, you'll see that art. Just think to yourself, have you ever seen a picture of an angel with wings on their backs playing a little harp and floating on a cloud? Those came about 100 and so years ago when people began to think of heaven not as a new heavens and new earth coming back, but some sort of abstract little place where we floated around. That's not a biblical idea of heaven. And once we thought that, we thought our souls were going there and we didn't need to care about this world. I pick on my late father at this point. He was a wonderful Christian man who worked in business, and he worked as hard as he could to earn as much money as he could to give away to missionaries because they did proper stuff. But while he was doing it, he drove along and he would get a fish and chip and a bottle of drink. And then when he finished, he'd throw it out the window because this world was being burnt up and it didn't matter. It was bad theology impacting him until his kids told him to wise up. And I pick on him just to say, like, I mean, some of us have that kind of, this world doesn't matter. We're going to escape to heaven when we die. That's all that matters. And so, no, the new heavens and new earth, God will make his dwelling place with humanity. The movement is from a garden, not back to a Garden of Eden, but off to a heavenly city. That's a really interesting kind of political dimension to it. We turn our swords into plowshares. Well, that's interesting. We're going to garden in it. Like, there's political aspects to the way this thing's being talked about. And so our role, as best I understand it, is to try and steward what we can of the kingdom into the here and now, as the church, but also in the political realm. And so we have this Daniel-like role of trying to navigate this space. The reason I think this is also important is this. Oh, what have I done? I've gone back. Somebody's allowed me to click my own clicker. I want to just finish then with this. I love this passage in Ephesians 1 from the Message. It's Peterson's translation of it. So Daniel's in your mind. Remember Daniel, okay? So this is supernatural stewarding into political spaces. And then this is what Paul says in Ephesians. All this energy issues from Christ. Now you'll know these verses, but you might hear them differently as I read them in this text. God raised him from death and set him on a throne in deep heaven, in charge of running the universe, everything from galaxies to governments. No name and no power exempt from his rule, not just for the time being, but forever. He's in charge of it all, has the final word on everything. At the center of all this, Christ rules the church. The church, you see, is not peripheral to the world. The world is peripheral to the church. The church is Christ's body, in which he speaks and acts and by which he fills everything with his presence. So the church, you see, is not peripheral to the world. That's how it probably feels at the moment. I read that, I think, well, church feels like it used to be at the center. We used to have our spires. You were at the center of the community, at the center of life. Everybody looked towards the church. Everybody wanted to know what the church thought. It feels like we're peripheral. Paul is reminding us, and he's writing to an early church. Remember this? The world is peripheral to the church. That would have seemed like madness at the time. They were on the margins. They were excluded. They had no clout, no influence. And he's reminding because Jesus is in deep heaven. He is on the throne ruling everything. And because of that, because he's head of the church cannot be peripheral. It's just not theologically, biblically possible. The world is peripheral to the church. The church is at the center. That's what we've been called into, but not to stay there, to go out on mission. So much as we love the gathered on the Sunday morning, we are scattered out during the week, and we are put out into all sorts of places. And that's where we get to have our influence around the world. Because politics is not just about the politicians on the front line. Politics is at every single level. I get to go and see the education minister as part of my role. I get to meet with politicians. The reality is my wife, who's on the school governors on our local primary school, has a lot more influence in my child's education than I have. I appear to be the influential one in our family. That's rubbish. I might be able to go to these meetings and go and sit down with them. They don't listen a lot to what I say. And we have these meetings. She goes in as on the board of governors, actually influence what happens. That's politics at all the levels. That's the kind of leadership I want to see in politics at every level. I want to pray for and support our politicians. I want to pray for those in the parties and around them, and the councillors and all the way through, and party members. And those are hard things to do. But actually, it's often on smaller levels, local community groups, school governors, and those sort of people who are also engaging in politics, looking after people and places. And the reality is they're carrying the kingdom of God, the Holy Spirit, supernatural solutions into the places. And I think that's the real challenge, is to drive this out through Christ's body, the church, which is in all sorts of places and is actually the fragrance and the salt that's impacting the world around. So I see it's 9, and that's perfect because my time is gone. I'll just say one other thing and then I'm happy to take questions. You can find out more about us at eauk.org. It would be remiss of me not to remind you we're a membership organisation. Our voice is only as strong as those who support us. And you can find out a bit about me on Twitter and places like that. I engage quite a bit in the political space and I love it. I hope this has been helpful, and I'm happy to kind of hang out and take some questions as Mark steers or directs me. So I'll stop sharing and switch back to that screen.
Peter, thank you so much for that. It has been incredibly informative, helpful for me as well. I love that analogy about Daniel, the Daniel plan at the end there. One of the things, I have a wee question, if I can selfishly jump in first. Daniel was forced into the Daniel plan. He didn't opt in. He was there because he was in exile. One of the things that I wrestle with growing up in Northern Ireland with the situation here is you either got involved with politics or you didn't. And I was turned off very, very quickly and early on and find it very difficult to engage. So for me, it's always been a challenge. I think you've answered the question for me in that there is a role that the church has to have, and we need to be proactive in that. Your example with the school governors is a case in point, and I think that that's right. But the voice of the church, with the point that you made about the 2-chapter instead of the 4-chapter narrative, what can the church do better or more to broaden that out, to help us become more stewards of this area that you're talking about?
I think it's a great question. I think actually 90% of what we do isn't contentious. Christians Against Poverty and Debt Counselling, welcoming of the Syrian refugees, many of the rights. When we sit down with the Human Rights Commission, actually on about 85–90%, we agree with them. Housing rights, prisoners' rights, rights before the court system, rights to a fair trial. Totally agree with loads of what they're doing. It's only on a couple of areas. And so what we're trying to do is emphasize that to them too. And we need to probably do that more culturally with many of our local councillors. The issues that they deal with are largely about local sports areas, community clubs, grounds, libraries, different things, but we're going to largely be on board, or maybe can help or offer support, or say we're happy to be responsible for that area or take that thing. So we often end up only appearing at the point of conflict. And so actually David Smith, my colleague's been really helpful at reminding me of this, because I am open to conflict, shall we say. I don't mind a bit of a Barney, as you'll maybe notice if you see me on the media. But we need to be really, so strong families, healthy communities, the justice, compassion stuff, many of those areas are natural bridge builds. So where can we do that well and get alongside a politician? At this moment, with all that's happening, can we just email or write to a politician just saying, I'm thinking of you, I'm praying for you and your family at this moment. I appreciate it must be a kind of nervous time for you. Really simple things like that, sending them a Christmas card, finding out when their birthday is, anything, just engaging them on those. So we can do a lot more positive. So the moment when we come with something that we're maybe challenging them a bit more, it's the 1 in 6 or 10 rather than, you've just appeared in my radar because you totally disagree with me on this one issue.
Very good.
That's just one small way I think we can get a bit better engaged.
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful. Thanks, Peter. Okay, we have I think a question coming up from Tracy. Remember, guys, you can put up your hands or put in the question into the comments. What do you think of those leaders of churches who went against what governments had mandated by not closing their churches? John MacArthur and others in the American context, it was quite widely publicized that. Is that the right thing to do? Thanks for that, Tracy.
Thanks, Tracy, for landing me right in the hot spot there. That's good. So these are great questions because, as I hinted or said earlier, we had a guy from Iran, our church on Sunday, and somebody else had referenced this to me already a couple of weeks ago. We said, when we talk to our persecuted brothers and sisters and say we have to wear masks in church, they're like, and your point is, no. If you follow me at all on social media, you know I push back a reasonable amount on the government regulations. I am saying only what's absolutely necessary. So I am anyway, I'm pushing a bit, but at the same time, I'd want to strike a balance. So there will be moments we're going to have to push back. I'm not convinced this is it. Masks is not the fight I particularly want to have. I don't particularly like them, but there are plenty of other things that I think are more fundamental, and there are moments we're going to need to lean in. I'm not convinced this is it. We are very alert to the kind of legislation the government has passed and the kind of powers they're trying to take or reserve at this moment, and there has been a fair amount of pushback. So I respect that others will take a different view. I don't have a problem with that. I want to see a consistency, and then I want to see a good, clear articulation as to why. I personally, I was going to say I'm happy to wear a mask. That's probably not entirely true, but I don't, that's not my hill to die on. There's plenty of other things I'm prepared to go out and fight much harder on. When I hear from an Iranian church brother, I think I can wear a mask to worship. No, we're not. You only have to wear them in and out at the minute, you know, and there's some, the legislation is changing. We need to keep it in a bigger context is what I would say. Let's consider our battles. That's the interesting thing about Daniel. So here's what intrigues me about Daniel. Belteshazzar was a name to a foreign god. Why did he not pick that line? I still don't know for sure, but it seems like there were certain things he could accept, even though he wasn't comfortable with them. Yeah. And then something true. So is there a right and wrong answer? No. I don't think it's as simple as that. But for me, that wasn't the line I was going to go after. There's something more mandatory vaccines, things like that I'm going to get much more excited about. Government's trying to tread a pretty difficult line, and I have a lot of sympathy for politicians. These aren't easy questions to answer.
Thanks for that. Great question. Anyone else, guys? I'm conscious of time, that we are past 9 o'clock, but we will let this go because it's just great to have Peter, and I want to use them. But if you need to go, please feel free to do that. But just want to give you some more opportunity. Ken, you've raised your hand. Work away, sir.
Yeah, Peter, just one question. We hear a number of politicians from our assembly who are calling for vaccine passports. And whilst at face value, it seems that there's nothing wrong with vaccine passports, but when we begin to dig into it, we find that they're through the requirement to have these passports, if they come about, that it will bring quite a few restrictions. What's your view on that?
I see another question saying not dissimilar about the mandated vaccines and having them to attend church. Certainly on that one, Samson, that wouldn't be our context in the UK. So I understand each jurisdiction has slightly different rules. Again, on social media, if you follow, I've been pushing back a little on the vaccine passport, saying I want to see evidence that it works. I want to see how you think it's going to work. How is it going to be introduced? Because I'm saying let's get a lot more detail so we know what we're talking about. What sort of data are you going to hold? Because I'm not persuaded even that it works. So let's do that evidentially first. Then I'd want to know at what level. I mean, I have a passport to travel to another country. I don't get excited about that, but I do have reservations about this. So I'm not saying they're immediately analogous, but it's interesting the things we are prepared to accept. I do need a verification to drive. That's standard. We don't think anything of that. Let's just think about this a bit further. But my general gut is government, stay back. I want to see generally a minimal rule. So I am concerned about the authoritarian tendencies of government. But again, there's a balance. It's not about, I want to talk to politicians respectfully. I want to make sure we're doing that well. What you see outside someone like Nick O'Malley's office from anti-vaxxers is not acceptable ways to engage. We're absolutely entitled to talk and push back. We've got to do that in respectful ways. So again, I'm not saying you're anyway. I'm just saying we've got to find better ways. Same with abortion. I want to push back heavily on MLAs on that, but I want to still do that in a respectful way. So we've got to have the passion of our convictions, but good ways to communicate. Kids' vaccinations in school, Raymond, because I see it. I'm double vaccinated. I'm happy to say that. So is my wife, but I have a 12-year-old daughter and she is not vaccinated. Because one, she can't actually yet get it, but also we have definitely hesitations about that. I don't understand at that age, it feels even less tested and even less benefit to anybody. That seems to be a little bit of politics. Now we'll keep that under review. So I think this is where we've got to make some decisions. I'm not an expert on vaccination. I am married to a pharmacist. We have thought about it. I'm trying to find that balance because it's coming up with a few questions. How do you honor government, but you're still entitled to challenge them? And I think that's perfectly fine. And that's what we'll consistently do.
Yeah, very good.
On the double vaccines that's coming up from Faye, and in Canada, I think there's a lot of countries are pushing really heavily on vaccine mandates, and I don't think that's healthy. And I think it's a good place for the church to say, actually, we're for freedom of choice, freedom of religion, freedom of belief, and all those. And we need to be really careful of how we limit freedoms. That's a great thing, I think, for us, the church, to be on the front foot of. We are the freedom people in an authoritarian society that in various ways is trying to clamp down. It would be great to be known as the champions of freedom, as long as we do that well, articulate why and what it is to be free in Christ, which is often the submission of what I want on behalf of the other. Now, I'm not saying that means we have to follow these mandates, but remember what the freedom is for. The Bible is just so interesting. It's absolutely championing freedom, but then God takes that very freedom in his son and submits his freedom below Pilate and is crucified for it. So like there's a big challenge as to what we have to do with the freedoms we've been given. And I want to see ways in which we upset the culture in a healthy way, like catch them out. Oh, I have these rights, but I'm prepared to give them up for you. Oh, I have this ability, but how does it look like to sacrifice it for you? I could do this, but I'm being called to do this. And I think that's where it gets really interesting for us.
Yeah, very good. Excellent. Wonderful. Anyone else?
I'm going to make one last shout out. If you follow me on social media or on EA, we're doing a church survey at the minute. And the reason I say that is because with churches regathering, we are really interested in what that looks like for people. So if you go onto my Twitter, if you follow me or Facebook or EA, what I'd love you to do is if you have time to do that, we're trying to get as much information in this regathering moment, how churches are navigating that space. Because we think this is the most seismic change the church has experienced in 100 years, back to my bridge. We want to help churches navigate it. So the more information we have, the better. That's the only reason we want it. And we'll be sharing all the results to help churchgoers, church leaders, work out what has changed in this moment and how we do any navigation of that well.
Fantastic. Faye, you've your hand raised.
What happened to the church that the Marines built? The bridge the Marines built?
Oh, so as I understand, that bridge is still there. The problem was they needed more capacity. The islands were growing. That was built quite some time ago. So I think it survived okay. This is further down. They needed a better bridge. I think.
Does it have a river? Does the river go under it?
I believe it did. It's the river moved on down a bit where this new bridge was. So
Faye, you were obviously really worried about that.
But it is bad. People have been saying, so what do you do? Because the purpose is to get you across the river, regardless of where the bridge is. But do we build a new bridge, or is it about boats? Are we doing it in different ways? Is it smaller units? Yeah. The whole purpose, I suppose, just to get us to think. This culture moved over here, and if we build a model, it's over here. And are we going to have to rethink? I think politicians are having to do that. Businesses are having to do that. But we as the church also need to redo it in this moment, is to rethink the things that worked 30 years ago. Don't work. There's the classic examples of a Sunday evening service that ends at a particular time because the train used to go then and the train stopped going 20 years ago, but we're still running the service at the same time. And it's like, this is a massive moment of readjustment. That's back to our survey. Like, how do we rethink our engagement? I think it's a fantastic opportunity. It's not what I'd have chosen, but it's going to get us to this would have been unimaginable 2 years ago. Mark and I were talking about this, the ability to do this in this way, to have such an international mix of people. How fantastic. What else do we need to reimagine to bring people on a journey towards Jesus in this moment that we wouldn't have conceived of 2 years ago?
Peter, do you have ideas, that regarding that, just as examples of how we can engage in new ways?
I mean, the glimpses we're getting is that people prefer potentially smaller at this moment, a bit more community oriented. The pastoral is going to be massive. So we know mental health is a huge issue. People are looking for forms of community and pastoring. So, I mean, I come from Causeway Coast Vineyard. Some of you know it's a pretty big church. That church will have a different challenge because people aren't as interested in that in the same way. So it's a real pastoral season and moment. How does that look different? How does it look to equip people to navigate that? People aren't traveling in the same ways to work. People aren't volunteering at the same level. We're tending to go to church, but go less regularly. So that's got some challenges. So I don't have all the answers. We can begin to see some of the trends. Actually, money isn't the main issue. It's going to be, how do we release people differently? But people are making different commitments and at different levels. People are spending more time with their families. What they learned was they weren't able to do family discipleship the way we thought they might have been able to. So when the scaffolding was stripped away, they weren't as well equipped to do that. We're going to need to do that better. That's a healthy thing if we do that well, because our kids are going into a really challenging environment in schools. And I get that. I'm pretty well equipped on this stuff, and I've got a 12-year-old, and it's going to be a challenge. So I'm imagining for everybody. So, but there are moments we reimagine and that starts to look different. And I actually think that's pretty exciting. But the gathered events will look a little less important in the scheme of things. Or why do we do them? Is it for communion? Is it for community? Is it for the presence and encounter with God, rather than some of the other things we maybe used to think it was all about, the preach moment? And I say that as a preacher.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Excellent. Ricky and Raymond, I've got your...
Yeah. See the tables that you're saying from God upwards, and those grey goes into the lighter. Where can you get more information about them? Because that actually struck me quite, where we're actually saying that God's actually made it authentic for me, that I can be gay and live with my partner. Where can you read more into that?
So short answer is, if you want, I can send Mark the slides. That is literally all. These have kind of evolved in the last few weeks. Pete Hughes, Tim Hughes' brother, who's a pastor in London, did a version of those. I borrowed them from him, have changed them a bit, and then we're circling back around as a team because we think those are actually quite important, and we're just trying to pack them out. So we have a Being Human project in EA, where we're trying to really take some of these ideas, and instead of being on the kind of back foot in the sexuality conversation, some of the others is to get on the front foot, get into these pyramids and understand them better. So short answer is I can send you the slides. Long answer is the Being Human project, but it's going to be the next few months. We're going to try and unpack these more and really wrestle with them and equip pastors and churches to get on the front foot in these conversations a little differently.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
And Raymond?
Hi, Peter.
Hi.
Peter, thank you for everything tonight. I just wanted to speak to you about the challenges of our kids at school. About a year ago, my 7-year-old son, I actually got a phone call from his teacher at work to say that my son was witness to a conversation between two of his peers talking about sexual intercourse in very fine detail. And she was just warning me about it. You know, this was what was coming home that day. And just as a Christian parent, I have two young boys, and I know with social media and stuff, and I hear them talking about stuff they heard at school. And when is a good time to really talk to your kids about sex? You know, about the things that they're going to face in the world, and just how much detail do you go into in that regard?
It's funny. My wife and I have a book upstairs by a guy called Mike Inkpen, I think it is. It's How God Made Me, and it's a kid's book, but it's relatively explicit. And we were working that through with our daughters. It's definitely awkward because we got it up because we were looking at, could we maybe rework some of this as our kids enter this space? How much do we tell them? How much do they need to know because of the environments they're going into? I wish they didn't have to know some of it now, but the reality is, as you said, their peers are learning it through phones, etc. And the level of access people give their kids on phones just mystifies. We were talking to a number of people coming through our door recently about this, going, why have you given them a phone at that age? Like, so with great reluctance, I'm happy to say we've given our 12-year-old, but she has a massive amount of restrictions on it. She can't do anything without my permission. Somebody heard me talking about this at an event recently, and they thought I was talking about my wife's phone. I was like, no, it's probably the other way around. But I mean, I can control just about everything and see every single thing she does. And it's only because she travels a reasonable distance that she's even got one, because we were very reluctant as she went into first year. But it's a huge thing. So I totally agree, Raymond. We're trying to navigate what that looks like. We haven't got it right, but we're also thinking about how we share that with other parents, because we're saying, for sure, she is having conversations that I wish she wasn't, but she needs to be equipped to know, and she needs to know which ones she needs to come back to us about. And also some other trusted people. The other thing we've said to our kids is, here are the 3 other people or couples we trust if for some reason you don't think you want to talk to us about it. And here, by the way, in brackets, are a couple that we don't, because we're journeying with them. They're great. We love them. But actually, it's these people you need to go to if there's an issue. And just to try and set a few things in place and be pretty intentional about that, because it, as you know, it's not even what it was 5 years ago. It is changing radically. The horror stuff, the sexual stuff, the stuff people are getting on their phones at such a young age is ridiculous. And much as I'd like to resist it. So the other thing we do is try and form as best a community. It's one of the reasons we love church, is to try and get a group of friends. And we're saying when people come into our house, we basically just take phones off. It's like, it's lovely you're here, fantastic, you're not playing your phone, but we have really good stuff we want you to do. We've got the trampoline, we've got the garden, we've got the swings, we've got other stuff going on. We'll play games, we'll totally engage you. You know, we've got to be proactive as well, but it's a total battleground. I'm with you.
Yeah, fantastic. Fantastic. All right, folks, are there any other questions? We're coming into land, I think. So if you're, Peter, it's an indication that there's still so many people on, that how interested people are. Anyone else? We'll give you your first warning. We're coming into land soon. Let you go and get your hot cocoa. Or as I haven't had my tea yet, by the way, so I always have my tea after this. So I'm going to be up with indigestion in the night. So thanks for that, folks. Any other questions?
Mark Stone, this is normal dinner time for you. Stop
It is,
pretending.
that's true. As me being a marker, I always eat late. Faye knows me well. So any others? All right. We are landing. Samuel, thank you for staying with us, man, in Kenya. Bless you, sir. It is so good to have you. I've been wanting to speak to you. It's week 4 now, and I've been wanting to speak to you and haven't had a chance yet, but it's been wonderful to have you join us,
Thank you.
along with your many of your pastors from Kenya. And before I just hand over to you, Samuel, to pray, Peter, can I just thank you once again for all the work that you have put in to tonight. It has been fascinating, helpful, engaging. You've given us a lot to go away and think and meditate upon. And let me give you another plug to fill in that questionnaire, folks. I know that Peter would really find that helpful. And just hearing some of the things that he had mentioned there about how churches are re-engaging after COVID is something that we're finding, the things that Peter has said that we're experiencing ourselves. So I know the more data that you can get, the better. But Peter, can I just thank you on behalf of Academy and everyone here for taking the time. Sorry for aging you a few years at the beginning with my ineptitude with my technology, but we got there in the end. So bless you, sir. And thank you once again.
Thank you.
Samuel,
Yes, Mark.
if you can close for us, if you can commit our time to the Lord, that would be great. Thank you so much, sir.
Yes, please, shall we pray? Our Heavenly Father, we want to thank you for such a precious night that we have had in your presence, hearing the truth and also being enlightened. We thank you for all the lectures and all the words we have heard. We want to thank you for Peter, and we want to thank you for the ability to have given him in knowledge and to impart to us the knowledge. Thank you for once again for Academy. Thank you for all of us. And we want to pray for a good night and a precious night, accompanied by your Holy Spirit, protection, and the grace of God be all upon all of us. We pray for Mark as he continues to conduct the school. We believe that good things are ahead of us. We thank you, protect each one of us, keep each one of us, until we next time, be glorified our Lord and our Shepherd. This we pray trusting in Jesus' name we pray.
Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Amen. Samuel, bless you. Thank you so much. Guys, that's us. Next week, we have Malcolm Duncan, who is our speaker. And Malcolm will be bringing the first of his 2 lectures. He's speaking in the last Monday of the course as well. It's hard to believe that next week we're halfway through. And Malcolm will be bringing another topic on this area of Christian leadership in this cultural moment. So I will hopefully get the notes out to you this week, as we normally do, with the link. Peter, again, thank you. Really appreciate you, sir. Check out EA. It's a great resource to check out. There's many things. A lot of the questions that we were touching on tonight have deep ethical issues, and EA lobby in these, as I'm sure you're aware, but they have a hive of information and resources. So if you're interested in anything further, you can contact Peter on the EA. He's put the link up for you, but you can dip into the resources there as well. So bless you guys. Thank you so much. We'll hang around just as is normal, and but we'll see you next week. God bless.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks, Mark. If you don't mind, I'm going to jump. I have
Peter,
a bedtime that if I can make it out now, I get to say goodnight to one. So,
bless you, sir. Thank you
thanks,
so much.
mate.
Really appreciate it. All right, pal.
Thank you. Bye, bye, bye.
Bye.